I used to think that we lived in an age of neoliberal excess. But that was before this existential regress, this stress, this distress of a malevolent virus, of an economic hiatus, of a climatic riotous, of a political diametric, of a carcinogenous cyst, culminating in this postmodern extremis, if one can call it that. I mean, for us, the privileged of our genus, there was an endless abundance of callous consumption, or so we thought. The Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sri Sat Kunaraja, and previous speakers, Professor Shivani Shanmugadas, Ms. Sivagauri Rajashanthan, Professor Ganeshalingam Shashikesh, members of the organizing committee of this conference, as well as members of the Center for Gender Equity and Equality, fellow academics, students. Good morning. Thank you, Senior Professor. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name for this very extensive introduction. Thank you very much, although you almost took away my poetic reading by that. I was delighted when the convener of the RSGEE, Ms. Sivagauri Rajashanthan, invited me to deliver this keynote at this year's conference. It was indeed a great honor, and I accepted with considerable humility and gratification, as it gives me the opportunity to visit Jaffna once again and to renew bonds of sisterhood and solidarity with the Center for Gender Equity and Equality after an interruption of about 4 years, I believe. And during that time, we as a nation has gone through many crises, national, local, and for me personal as well. But I remember with great pleasure and with some poignancy the last time I was here 4 years ago with the South Asian woman feminist activist, social scientist and writer, the late Kamla Singh, for a gender workshop. I recited a few stanzas of poetry earlier in order to create an ambience in which to deliver my address, which is titled Sustainable Development Through Gender Equity and Equality in the New Normal, an Ontological Perspective. And let me warn you, I plan on bursting into more poetry from time to time, so please don't get disturbed. Ever since the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, sustainable development in that popular imagination has come to mean the implementation of the SDGs. Of course, you may remember that the term was first referred to in a book related to the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment half a century ago, in 1972. The Brundtland report of Our Common Future, headed by the Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland in 1987, makes an emotive appeal by stating, I quote, "Humanity has the ability to make development sustainable, to ensure that it meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs." And this has more or less become a defining locution for sustainable development today. Now, it is not within the purview of this address to linger on the conceptual trajectory of sustainable development channeled through various UN conferences over the last few decades, from Stockholm to Rio de Janeiro to the launch of the SDGs in 2015. As we are all aware, 193 countries have committed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, which outlines 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 associated targets. Unlike the developmental framework of the Millennium Development Goals 2000 to 2015, which were considered to be somewhat simplistic and its aspirations somewhat apathetic, UN literature informs us that the SDGs are integrated and far-reaching, that they are balanced on Elkingston's 3 ontological pillars constituting economic viability, environmental protection, and social equity. That they link the present with the future and as such are multi-generational, that they scale the local, the regional, and the national. Moreover, that they are founded on integrated human needs as opposed to wants, and have to be inescapably intertwined with governance, with technology, and as has been argued of late by Zeng and all, with culture, or rather, the diversity and proliferation of cultures. And still, the northern woman, Sivaranjani, stands still by the roadside in Mullaitivu, a hand on her hip, the sun in her head, a glint in her nostril, awaiting the arrival of transitional justice by the SLTB bus. But he never comes. Meanwhile, lifetimes have passed in the limpid eyes of the Tamil Sahodari, even though she is only 70 years of age. SDG 5 on gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls is not only a standalone goal, but one that also cross-cuts and intersects all other goals. The 9 targets of this goal seem to recognize that gender inequality and women's oppression are entrenched in structural forces, ideologies, and institutions, both public and private, and manifests themselves in highly inequitable and discriminatory social norms and practices, which cut across economic, political, social, and cultural arenas. Moreover, the rest of the SDGs are invested with a gender lens so as to enable women and girls, encourage their participation in the implementation of all goals, and ultimately ensure a positive impact of all SDGs on women and girls. No doubt this can be seen as a promising initiative as it arises from the gaps and snags of hitherto historical conceptual frames and strands of women in development, WID, women and development, WAD, gender and development, GAD, as well as gender mainstreaming and intersectionality. And theoretically, the SDGs strive to merge historical development thinking on gender. First, of the social category of women as founded on similarities between 2 sexes, genders, and therefore requiring equal treatment, gender equality. Second, the social category of women as founded on the differences between the 2 sexes, genders, and therefore requiring empowerment via affirmative action, or what CEDAW, the Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, calls substantive equality. The need to address the differences between the 2 genders differentially, but still equally, with equality in results. Of course, this is also termed gender equity. However, these versions of gender are not able to cognize gender other than as a binary that locates and cements men and women as 2 static opposites. However, today, gender is understood as incorporating the 3 dimensions of the body, identity, and social gender, and even as constituting a diversity or spectrum of sexual and gender identities. As individuals continue to self-identify their gender status in relation to gender identity, sexual orientation, gender oppression, or sex characteristics, as shown by gender researchers such as Park and Menon. Not only in relation to the Western identities of straight, gay, lesbian, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, and asexual, but also culture-specific terms such as Metis in Nepal, Cathay in Thailand, Kuchu in the Swahili language, Badake in North American Indian cultures, Bakla in the Tagalog language, Fafafine in Samoa, Hijra and Kinna in Hindi, and Banesha in the Balkans, or any term that they wish. While the SDGs do not explicitly refer to these fluid and expanded possibilities of gender, LGBTQI+ academics and activists worldwide have seen the framework as an opportunity to demand the inclusion of their interests into global development agenda and into national priorities, policies, and programs. To this end, both women and the LGBTQI+ communities have worked relentlessly on the specific targets of the SDGs, such as the social protection systems, target 1.4, achieving universal health and coverage, target 3.8, ending violence against and exploitation of women and girls, target 5.2, promoting the rule of law and ensuring equal access to justice, target 16.3, adopting fiscal and social policies that promote equality, target 10.4, ensuring public access to information and ensuring fundamental freedoms, target 16.10. For instance, let me state the obvious. Legal gender recognition of a person's current gender identity through the amendment of official personal identification documents is vital for transgender individuals, given that a person's ability to vote, bank, travel, rent a home, and seek medical assistance, etc., would be reliant on their personal legal documents. In Sri Lanka, there is also a need of what is called a clear birth certificate, which does not indicate the previous sex, gender, or transgender, or an intersex people, among them children. Now, feminist critiques of the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, range from the economic and financial, that the SDGs do not interrogate the fundamental beliefs of neoliberal economic models, which focus on economic growth, industrialization, free markets, as well as globalization, and which have come under severe strain in our times. That there is inadequate SDG funding available for nation states. The achievements of the goals are reliant solely on the motivation and goodwill of governments, INGOs, NGO sectors, private sectors, etc. The political, that the SDG targets do not engage sufficiently with the power differentials in social relations, either at macro or micro levels. Rather, it takes as given the hierarchies of gender, class, region, language, levels of development, historical inequalities, etc. The methodological, that the SDGs are based on the positivist assumption that all transformation is definitive and measurable. The final outcomes of the SDGs are reduced to numerical outcomes which may not necessarily construct or represent intangible on-ground social changes. And the cultural. Despite the good intentions of the SDG 5 targets, inadequate understanding of gender issues as well as discriminatory attitudes amongst local policymakers, implementers and monitoring agents can easily derail progress. During the next segment of my speech, I will theoretically locate the global project of sustainable development. In other words, I would like to engage with the SDGs ontologically and epistemologically. I believe the VC has already located this conference ontologically earlier on. I use the word ontology to mean the understanding of reality, or what constitutes reality, or the existence of reality. And I use the term epistemology to indicate ways and possibilities of knowing that reality or the existence of that reality. Of course, as scholars, we are all mindful that it is often challenging to disentangle ontology and epistemology, given that our ways of knowing reality or understanding reality cannot always be distinguished from our ways of experiencing reality. And actually, to be quite honest, the Vice-Chancellor has preceded me, because in the morning, early on, he referred to the Hindu ontology and epistemology of reality and knowledge creation. Consequently, my question at this point is, what are the core assumptions of global reality behind the formulation and implementation of the SDGs? The predominant ontological belief fueling sustainable development emanates from the perspective of liberalism, with its historic roots in the Enlightenment movement in the West and its cornerstones of reason, humanism, universal truth, and history as a progression. And this comes from 200 years ago or more. Liberal values have been the overarching epistemology of the so-called civilizing project of modernity, modernism, and modernization from the 19th to the 21st centuries, which has manifested in neoliberalism and globalization by the 21st century. The SDGs thus center on the ontological belief in a rational human subject who is bestowed with fundamental rights, as the human subject is deemed to be distinct from and superior to animals due to the power of intellectual reasoning, as well as the ability to control both internal emotions and the external state of nature. This is the foundational premise of the age of the Anthropocene. As you can see, the SDGs strive to ensure that no one is left behind. They also draw on an Aristotelian hegemony of reason or logic and rationality, as well as the Enlightenment tenets of science, observation, and empirical evidence. And therefore, there is a heavy emphasis on the monitoring and evaluation of the SDGs. Furthermore, they subscribe to the principal understanding that certain universal principles are generalizable from the personal to people and to societies, as proposed originally by Immanuel Kant, the French philosopher of the 18th century. In this sense, the idea of sustainable development is a grand narrative, and in this instance, of progress and civilization. Finally, history is conceptualized as always moving forward, always moving towards some kind of purpose or teleological conclusion. Development, then, is comprehended as material, cognitive, and moral progress. For example, the SDGs take into account the needs of the present and future generations, grounded on the assumption that the function of development is to create a better society. Apart from these assumptions, the SDGs are also anchored in the underlying system of enlightenment-based values, including pacifism, egalitarianism, freedom, space, solidarity, and justice. And do I think that liberal democracy will save me? Even centuries ago, the Athenians knew that she was just a perverted myth, whether direct or representative or otherwise. But today, she is gunned down by postmodern practice. Yet interestingly, the epistemological assumptions relating to the SDGs do not halt at modernity. Rather, it would seem that inherent to the SDGs are also features and assumptions of postmodernity. Western, in the intellectual tradition or ontology of postmodernism and post-structuralism, the world and the individual is understood to be socially constructed, very often by language and discourse. Western theorists like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean Baudrillard, Jean-François Lyotard, and Slavoj Žižek are often skeptical about and deconstruct what are considered to be the essences and definitions of things, self-evident truths, transcendental origins, particularly of religions and the law, natural reference, grand narratives, centers, fixities, including the centrality and the stability of the human subject or the self. Instead, they explore multiplicity, localized truths, diversity, nuances, conflicts, displacements, and contradictions. Now, today, this leaves us thirsting for the truth or any truth, searching, researching, quantifying, qualifying, collaborating, confabulating, constructing, deconstructing, reconstructing, dismembering, Googling, opining, truth tabling, experimenting, replicating, predicating, validating, meditating, praying for a truth ceaselessly. But can the truth be known? Yet postmodernity and modernity are not mutually exclusive. For instance, notions of free choice, diversity, and the capacity for critical expression are common to both modernity and postmodernity. Postmodernity, then, is not to be considered a negation of the antithesis of modernity, nor is postmodernity to be seen as superseding modernity. In fact, our perceptions of realities today tend towards both the modern and the postmodern simultaneously. Take, for instance, the understanding of intersectionality, the analytical framework originally proposed by feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to demonstrate the crosscuts of race and gender, which is now utilized to establish how interlocking systems not only of gender and race, but other interlocking systems of power can impact the most marginalized in a community. Within the SDG discourse, the dimensions of people, the planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships are understood to overlap each other and are codependent on each other. To break that down, you cannot achieve SDG 5, gender equality and women's empowerment, without SDG 1, no poverty, without addressing SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, which can't be achieved without the implications that come with achieving SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and so on. Postmodern thinking is also reflected in the SDG methods of evaluation. Take the concept of self-referentiality. The SDGs utilize each country's own baseline data to measure progress over the ensuing 15 years, even though sustainable development is considered a grand vision of modern unification and standardization. Yet, are we stranded within the fault lines of our fundamental premise, within a serrated split in paradigm of what we consider to be the truth of our reality that has rapidly gone amiss, with the gilded fantasies of the last centuries, democracy and modernization decaying into debris in our hands? The SDGs may well reflect the dominant ontologies and epistemologies at play or in conflict with one another, but can they grasp and grapple with the insecurities, uncertainties, and instabilities of our times? Because one cost of contemporary civilization and our moment of existence, with its heightened crosscuts relating to environment, technology, and culture, is that of risk, as pointed out by Adam Plachek. The last few years have made us acutely aware of the accumulation and intensification of risks from these very facets and extents of nature and civilization. I believe that the scholars at this conference will go on to highlight the unprecedented health, ecological, social, and economic risks, threats, and upheaval which have not only taken human lives but also generated and molded gender inequality and inequity during the last couple of years in Sri Lanka. Our adversary, that slop the scale, is an indiscernible germ that glides in the air, that strikes us unaware, sounds forewarning of disease and demise, leaving our bodies locked in ascetic extremis. In other words, of COVID-19 and its knock-on effects on the health and incomes, while we women have been induced under lockdown to grind and grind and grind ourselves into grits for household production, for sexual reproduction, until one day a woman's palm squashed the blood-sucking silver-black striped parasite within her family. Of the escalation of violence, increase in unpaid workloads, physical safety, freedom, and leisure within the households for women. But on reflection, can we definitely blame or absolve? Can we truly reason who or why or how? Can we really trace cause and effect or action or reaction in the commodification of products, the production of technology, the technologization of industry, the industrialization of the globe, the globalization of multinationals, the multinationalization of capitalism, the capitalization of democracy, the democratization of the digital, the digitalization of politics, the politicization of religion, the religionization of commodities, the commodification of products, of the perpetuation of unsustainable systems of consumption and production that have led to deprivation and augmented poverty. Blemishes on the sun, followed by days and days of shadow, followed by crashing rain, falling on rust, soil, crumbling under your feet, land sliding off hilltops and highlands, falling on creeks, cascades, canals, rivers, swampland, lagoons, overflowing on hamlets and households, suburbs and settlements, townships and the metropolis, portending the gloaming years of the Kali Yuga. Of hurtling climate mutations and other environmental as well as human-caused disasters of governance that have led to humanitarian crisis once again with its differential, multi-layered and multidimensional impacts, particularly on women. Our rage spills crimson on these tarred roads, but can revolt alone be enough? Of increasing nationalisms and parochiality, discriminations, social protests, and uprisings. As all hail the new truths of the era, intrigues, inanities, litanies, banalities, home truths, homilies, totalities, fatalities, celebrities, fake news, memes, remedies, parodies, indiscriminate generalities. Of the digital ontologies or the acceptance of digital cultures as realities that are replacing and recasting human interactions. It is no surprise then that the UN Women's Gender Snapshot on the progress of the SDGs as at 2022 indicates that the world is not on track to achieve the aspirations of gender equality by 2030, if it ever were. And somewhat disappointingly, only 47% of data required to track progress on gender SDG 5 are currently available, rendering women and girls effectively invisible. While the aspirations of modernity and enlightenment and the Enlightenment civilizing project has been to anticipate, project, assess, control, and prevent these growing dangers and threats, humankind has as yet to dominate the dimension of fate or destiny. On the other hand, postmodernist consciousness of dealing with these hazards, upheavals, and insecurities have been through cultures of revolutionary political awakenings and personal activism, which is generating an amplified new morality and vice versa. This morality often expresses itself in activist cultures that include extreme woke or wokeism in Western countries, singularly negative standpoints, intense political polarizations, righteousness, irreverence, moral censure and erasure, individual invective, mass public protests, and cancel cultures. Unfortunately, nation-states have continued to respond to these manifestations and cultures of post-modernity with the structures, apparatus, and tools of modernity. Consequently, it is important to note that development literature tends to portray the concept of culture either as constituent or as functional or as both in relation to sustainable development. A panel regression study by Sinju et al. In 2019, synthesizing existing evidence, shows that cultural traits are linked to the achievement of all 17 SDGs, represented by 133 or 79% of the 169 SDG targets. The results of this statistical analysis provide evidence that cultural values can be attributed to explain as much as 26% of the variations in the achievements of the SDGs, even though the links are strikingly divergent across cultural traits and across SDGs. The path to gender equality and equity through sustainable development needs to account for and resolve two compelling ontological factors: the omnipresent element of risk in life and how we anticipate and mitigate these risks that are not only ontological or ecological, that are not only ecological but also human caused, due to intent or error or due to failed systems, a challenge from the modernist perspective. The personal conviction that our subjective ontologies and epistemologies are accurate and superior, that they are the truth, a challenge from the postmodernist perspective. I chose to engage with the theme of this conference from an ontological perspective, mainly because I feel that we as academics and activists tend to approach our work without much consideration of and for the wider ontological span and scope of our existence. Because our epistemologies are linked to our disciplines, and apart from the advent of reflexivity and interdisciplinary transdisciplinary research, we have a tendency to work in silos. Moreover, because our work is often only governed by the political and other considerations of the here and the now. I will leave you with the following lines, and then eventually our time too will skulk off to the naked acreages of the Singharaja, to heave and heave and heave, birthing in extremis yet another premise of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or some blood-stained cosmic metamorphosis, or perhaps a butterfly fluttering to materialize from a chrysalis, all of which will not shackle us, as we will be free and mercifully not there to see. Nandri. Thank you very much.